Somewhere in New Mexico, in 1968, a woman pulls a pickup truck into a small, dusty town called Cuba, little more than a gas station and a dirt track full of roadrunners, and asks the man behind the counter if anyone nearby has land with a spring for rent. She has been driving for over a year. She has been through the Pacific Northwest, through Canada, through Death Valley. She has been sleeping in the camper on the back of the truck in empty forest parks that in summer hold thousands of people, and right now hold no one but her. Nobody in the art world has seen much of her. Nobody knows exactly where she is. The man suggests his wife's property on the Portales Mesa, 50 acres, 20 miles from the nearest highway. The nearest neighbor is 6 miles away. No electricity, no telephone, $10 a month. She takes it. Her name is Agnes Martin. A little over a year before this moment, she was one of the most critically acclaimed painters in New York. She had been in group exhibitions at the Whitney, the Guggenheim, and the Jewish Museum. The New York Times had been writing about her as an artist the reader was simply expected to know. Harper's Bazaar had just named her one of their 100 Women of Achievement, and when she showed up to the ceremony in moccasins and a wrinkled skirt, security turned her away at the door. So she shrugged and went for a walk. In the summer of 1967, she had walked into the Pace Gallery carrying everything she owned that was art-related, brushes, canvases, stretchers, and asked the dealer, Arnie Glimsher, to give it all away to young artists. Then she got in a truck and left. She would not make another painting for 4.5 years. What came after, the work she made on that mesa and in the New Mexican desert for the next 30 years, is widely considered the most significant painting of her career. The idea that an artist needs to be in the right place, the right city, the right room to make the work that matters, Agnes Martin didn't have the energy for it. She never really had. And in leaving, she was finally able to arrive. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. To understand the departure, you have to understand the person. And understanding Agnes Martin means getting comfortable with contradiction, because she was full of it, deliberately and on principle. She was born in 1912 in Macklin, Saskatchewan, a prairie farming town essentially still operating in the 19th century. Her father died when she was 3, right as the town was entering a stretch of hard economic years, and her mother raised 4 children largely on her own. Self-sufficiency wasn't a philosophy in Macklin. It was just survival. Her birthright, as it's been described, was, quote, starting from scratch, working hard and alone with the simplest tools until the job, however exorbitant its demands, is done, keeping your own counsel and staying tuned to the earth's glory, end quote. When Agnes Martin eventually left New York for the desert, she wasn't reinventing herself. She was going back to the conditions that had formed her. She was nomadic from the start, from Macklin to Vancouver to Washington, then back and forth between Vancouver and Washington, never settling anywhere for long. In Vancouver, she nearly made the Olympic swimming team. It's a detail that feels right for her, because swimming, even as a team sport, is a fundamentally solitary act. You're alone in the water. You can hear the sounds of the crowd only intermittently, and then you bob back under into silence. The rhythm of Agnes Martin's entire career looks a little like that. Periods of noise and recognition, and then the plunge back under, into the quiet where the real work happened. Depending on who you asked, Agnes Martin was a sage, an ascetic, a pragmatist, a mystic, a fiercely private person with an uncanny ability to befriend almost anyone. She explicitly rejected the sage label, but she also exploited it when it helped her get out of things she didn't want to do. She was compassionate and inquisitive and categorically refused to let anyone truly know her. She let people misread her when it suited her, and there is substantial evidence she knew exactly what she was doing. All of this was true simultaneously, and she was aware of all of it, and she used it all. Her mental illness is also a part of this picture without being the entire explanation for it. She had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia by adulthood, and she kept it almost entirely hidden for her whole life. What she called her quote-unquote trances, the episodes, the wandering, the voices, she insisted were entirely separate from what she called her quote-unquote inspirations, the visions in which she saw a painting fully formed before she ever touched a canvas. She didn't think of the illness as a creative resource. But the silence she needed to work and the silence the illness demanded were not, in practice, unrelated. She first went to New Mexico in 1946 and stayed for nearly a decade, moving between Albuquerque and Taos. It was here that she began to take painting seriously. The landscape echoes Saskatchewan in ways that go beyond the visual. Vast, extreme. The light with what's been described as, quote, a remarkable brilliance and clarity, end quote. The weather swinging wildly from hour to hour. She was, without fully knowing it yet, already home. One more thing worth knowing about Agnes Martin before she made her way to New York. She was in her late 40s when she finally developed the grids that would make her famous. The woman who will be defined by that signature form, penciled horizontal lines on square canvases with radical, luminous quietness, isn't even painting grids yet at an age when most artists are considered fully formed. Agnes Martin was always working on her own schedule, and the schedule was longer than anyone expected. She came to New York in 1957 because Betty Parsons, one of the most important dealers in the city, buys 5 of her paintings during a visit to Taos and promises to show her work, on the condition that Martin lived there. So Martin gathered herself for the bracing plunge into an art world whose intensity she found both nourishing and ultimately insupportable. She ends up at Coentus Slip, a row of abandoned 19th century warehouses at the southernmost tip of Manhattan, profoundly isolated from the rest of the city, sharing more in atmosphere with Taos than with Midtown. Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Jack Youngerman, Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Indiana, and the weaver Lenore Tawney are her neighbors. And what made this community unusual, what made it the right place for Agnes Martin specifically, had nothing to do with aesthetics. These artists didn't necessarily share a style. What they shared was a radical commitment to privacy. They weren't the Cedar Bar crowd. They weren't interested in Clement Greenberg's scene or the abstract expressionist hangouts uptown, which they found oppressive. They were a group of artists who had been washed ashore and were glad to find each other, united above all else by a profound respect for privacy. That's what Agnes Martin fit into. Not minimalism, not geometric abstraction, not any of the categories the art world would later spend decades pressing her into. She fit into a community that understood that work came before everything, and that the best thing you could do for another artist was to leave them alone. Her grids finally arrive around 1958. Square canvases, penciled horizontal lines, a quietness so radical it made people uncomfortable. The minimalists immediately tried to claim her, and Martin immediately resisted, saying, quote, "I considered myself to be an abstract expressionist, but they considered me a minimalist. I couldn't do anything about that," end quote. Her paintings, she insisted, were about innocence and happiness. They weren't cool, they weren't impersonal, they weren't the studied nonchalance of Sol LeWitt or Donald Judd. But the art world filed her under geometry and called it a day. She let them because she had always let misreadings happen when they were convenient. What mattered to her was the work, not the label. By 1965, she's being written about as a known quantity. By 1966, she's in the major museum shows. Her career is by any measure working. And Agnes Martin is, by almost any measure, falling apart. During these years in New York, she had a relationship with a Greek sculptor named Chryssa, younger by 21 years, charismatic, volatile, with her artistic sensibility shaped in genuine dialogue with Agnes's own. Both women struggled with psychotic episodes. That turmoil makes Chryssa creative, but it makes Agnes anxious and puts her on edge in ways that accumulate and don't resolve. Betty Parsons calls the relationship a mess. It is widely believed, though never publicly stated, that its breakdown is one of the direct reasons for what happens next. One day, Agnes is found wandering South Street, not recognizing her close friend Robert Indiana when he passes by her on the street. She is committed to Bellevue Hospital, placed with severely disturbed patients, physically restrained, and given electroconvulsive therapy. Her Coentus slip friends rally to have her transferred to a better hospital. She later says that she had shock therapy at Bellevue more than 100 times before they were able to make that happen. She keeps almost all of this private for the rest of her life. But she does write in a letter shortly afterwards, quote, "Every day I suddenly felt I wanted to die, and it was connected with painting," end quote. Also at this time, her studio at 28 South Street, the one she'd had at Coentus Slip, which was 125 feet long, with wide skylights and windows directly looking out onto the river, is coming down. The city is developing the waterfront, and with it, the last physical anchor Martin had to New York is disappearing. This is the reason she gives most often, and it is probably not the whole truth. But with Agnes Martin, the whole truth was never really available. What she offered instead were fragments, and depending on the year or the mood or the interviewer, a different fragment rose to the surface. There's the practical version. The loft is being demolished, and at the same time she finds out that news, she gets a $5,000 grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, so she takes a bus to Detroit and goes straight to a Dodge dealership. Quote, "I picked out the liveliest salesman and said, 'Here's a check for $5,000. What kind of truck can haul a camper?' End quote. Then there's the introspective version, which she only rarely offered. Quote, "I came to a place of recognition, of confusion that had to be solved. I waited patiently for something like permission to leave." End quote. And the competitive version, which she gave at other points. Quote, "I was driven away by the lust of the young painters wanting to be so successful. I thought, I'll just go away and let them be successful in my place." End quote. And also that summer, the painter Ad Reinhardt, her closest intellectual ally in the New York art world, dies. It was probably a little bit of all of these. The loft, Reinhardt, Chryssa, the noise, the illness, the art world's insistence on misunderstanding her, the weight of a success she had never quite trusted. These things all converged in the summer of 1967, and Agnes Martin did, what Agnes Martin had always done when conditions became insupportable. She trusted her gut and moved. She had done it before, from Saskatchewan, from Washington, from New Mexico to New York. She had never been someone who stayed past the point her instincts told her to go, and she had never needed the decision to make sense to anyone else. The brave thing wasn't leaving. The brave thing was trusting that the instinct was enough, even when she couldn't have told you exactly what it was pointing her toward. She chops off her hair, destroys some paintings and puts the rest in storage, walks into the Pace Gallery and gives away everything she owns that has anything to do with making art. Betty Parsons sends her off with a poem. For those who knew Agnes best, none of this is a surprise. But what the general art world gets is silence. And eventually, the line that contains everything. Quote, I had 10 one-man shows, and I was discovered in every one of them. Finally, when I left town, I was discovered again. Discovered to be missing, end quote. Here is how the story of what happened next is usually told. Agnes Martin vanished into the desert in 1967 and wasn't seen or heard from until she mysteriously emerged in New Mexico with new paintings. It has the quality of legend. It also, as is everything with Agnes Martin, more complicated than that. She does drive through the Pacific Northwest, through Canada, through the American Southwest, and she writes letters to friends like Sam Wagstaff and Lenore Tawney. Lenore even flies out to join her at Big Sur, and they drive through Death Valley to Arizona together. Throughout all of this, she's working odd jobs, packing ice cream, managing cherry pickers, working as a baker's helper. She canoes and camps in forests. But what she does not do is paint. She is alone, but she's not isolated. She is silent, but she's not totally absent. What she's actually doing, as she later admits, is less heroic than the myth. Quote, I found out that it's not enlightening. I think that what you're supposed to do is stay in the midst of life, end quote. She is, as ever, not quite what anyone expected. Not the desert saint, not the visionary in exile. Just a woman working something out on her own terms and being honest eventually about the limits of the experiment. Even during these so-called silent years, the art world didn't forget her. She's put in group shows at the Whitney, at MoMA, at the Tate in London, at Documenta 5 in Kassel, Germany. Her work is being collected and exhibited and written about. She is present everywhere except literally in the room, which means she is present without being able to shape the conversation. And what she's actually looking for underneath all of the contradictory explanations is simpler than the myth suggests. She believed deeply in the possibility of an absolute quiet, which is best found in nature. The noise, the city, the art world, the illness, all of it, had become impossible to separate from each other, and she needed it to stop. And eventually, at a gas station in Cuba, New Mexico, she finds the place quiet enough to begin again. When Agnes Martin reappears, it is a shock to the system. Not because nobody knew she existed, but because the version of her that had been building in her absence turns out to be wrong. Without her there to guide the conversation, the art world had been having it without her. The minimalists had strengthened their claim on her legacy, and the categories had hardened. And then, in January 1973, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia opens the first major retrospective of her work, comprising 37 large paintings, 35 drawings, and 3 constructions. And critics are forced to look again properly at a body of work they had been misfiling for years. The near consensus that emerges is that she was never a minimalist. She was never a geometric abstractionist. She was something the existing categories didn't have a name for. A committed outlier whose work was stranger and more serious and more human than anyone had been willing to say while she was in the room to complicate it. Martin tells the curator afterward that the show gave her the courage to paint again. And what she comes back with is not a continuation of the New York work. It is something else entirely. The New York grids had been tightly penciled, controlled, and intricate. All of that restless internal energy organized into a rigid structure. The new work starts to breathe. The grids give way to broad horizontal stripes painted in diluted acrylic, sometimes barely there. There are layers in the colors of sand and apricots, the color of morning sky. The paintings are large, 6 feet square, and they are made in series with 8 to 20 related canvases at a time, each one distinct but connected, meaning spreading across the whole body of work rather than residing in any single image. And the process of making them is, in its way, as extreme as the landscapes she made them in. She waited, sometimes for months, until she saw the complete painting in her mind. A tiny, full-color vision of what the canvas would become. Then came the painstaking labor of scaling it up. Pages of fractions and long division with measurements marked in pencil along strips of tape. Only then did she apply the color, working fast. If there were drips or blots or any deviation from the vision, she destroyed the canvas with a knife or a box cutter, sometimes hurling it off the mesa, and she began again. Every mark in a finished Agnes Martin painting is intentional. The perfection in them is hard-won. What the critics found when the new work emerged was something they didn't quite have the language for. The New York Times found, quote, the quality of religious utterance, almost a form of prayer, end quote. In the older grids, the New York Times found, quote, the quality of religious utterance, almost a form of prayer, end quote, but said the palette of the new paintings was too distilled to be called color at all. They thought it was better described as light. Another critic put it this way: these images of absolute calm did not arise from a life replete with love or ease, but out of turbulence and solitude and hardship. They represent an act of dogged will and extreme effort. The paintings look like serenity, but they were made like a battle. In 1974, she walks back into the Pace Gallery and asks if they'd like to show her new work. Over the next 29 years, she would have 21 solo shows there. And the style she arrives at in the desert is the one she works in for the rest of her life, painting until she is 92. Her oldest friend, Christina Wilson, puts it simply, quote, she made a very smart move. In a sense, she died. And when you die, you get famous. And then she came back to life. She never made a mistake. Every move she made, it all led to building up this mythical being, end quote. The Whitney gives her its largest retrospective in 1992. The Tate, LACMA, and the Guggenheim mount a joint retrospective in 2015, framing it explicitly as a corrective, a reassessment of a position they argue had been kept for too long on the margins of the historical record. Agnes Martin gave many explanations for leaving New York, and none of them were the whole truth, because Agnes Martin never gave anyone the whole truth about anything, ever. What she gave instead were fragments that pointed towards something she couldn't quite articulate, and probably wouldn't have even if she could. She contained multitudes, and she protected all of them, and the art world spent decades trying to file her correctly and kept getting it wrong. But the paintings say it. She didn't leave to escape the art world. She left because the work had always been trying to get somewhere that the art world, with all of its noise and categories and openings and ambition, was standing directly in front of. The art world's geography of legitimacy, that you must be here, you must be seen, you must stay in the room, has always been more about the market's needs than the artist's. Agnes Martin happened to be one of the few people honest enough to act on that. She had to leave to arrive. And the room she walked out of spent the rest of her life trying to find its way back to her door. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.